Hello everyone, this is Bob Remedi. I'm recording this little video to give you some background information and a little bit of context for completing the Environmental Biology 120 Lab number 4, which deals with air pollution. So a little bit of background in air pollution. Air pollution can be defined as chemicals in the air in concentrations that are high enough to cause harm. Now, air pollution can certainly be caused by natural events, things like volcanoes or plants. This is a picture, this is actually taken from the Appalachian Mountains looking into the Blue Ridge. And if you look in the mountain, or you look in the picture here, you can see ridge after ridge after ridge. And the farther back you go, it gets fainter and fainter. And part of the reason for that is this bluish haze that you see in the picture. Now that haze is actually produced by organic chemicals that are given off by some of the trees in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and hence the name Blue Ridge. And some people would consider some of those chemicals, if they have sensitivities to it, to be harmful. So although air pollution can certainly be caused by natural events, most types of air pollution are anthropogenic, which means they're caused by humans. Now I want to look at the difference between primary pollutants and secondary pollutants. So a primary pollutant would be a pollutant that is released directly into the air. So for instance, let's say you were looking at the tailpipe of a car, and the gases that were coming out of the car would be considered a primary pollutant. Now in some cases, those gases go up into the atmosphere, and as a result of sunlight providing some energy or interacting maybe with some of the water in our atmosphere, it's going to cause those primary pollutants to be converted into something else. And that's what we mean by a secondary pollutant. So secondary pollutants are made by changing primary pollutants into something else. And some good examples of this would be ozone and the acids that are responsible for acid precipitation, which is the big fancy term for acid rain, which includes acid snow, acid hail, acid fog, etc. So acid precipitation or acid rain forms when oxides like sulfur dioxide are going to dissolve in atmospheric water, little droplets of water up in the air, and it's going to make those water droplets acidic. Now, when those water droplets fall as precipitation, again, could be rain, could be snow, could be fog, etc., the acid in that precipitation is going to stress out some organisms, and it's going to outright kill others. In this photograph that you see here, these are actually pine trees, which you may remember from lab number 2, which are gymnosperms, were actually killed as a result of the soil being too acidic from this acid precipitation. This is actually a picture of a marble statue taken in Rome, Italy, near the Termini station. And over the years, the acids in the precipitation have actually broken down some of the marble, so it's losing some of its definition there. So smog is a good example of a secondary pollutant. So when nitrogen oxides mix with other pollutants using sunlight energy to kind of power all of this, you end up with something called photochemical smog. The photo meaning light from the sun, smog being a combination of smoke and fog. Okay, and we said sunlight energy is going to be responsible for causing this change, and smog is ugly. It's a respiratory irritant, so if you go out and you're breathing in this smog, it can make you kind of uncomfortable. People who have respiratory illnesses like asthma and COPD, smog can actually be pretty dangerous. And when smog is paired with something called a thermal inversion, it gets even more dangerous still. So here we see typical environment. Here you see the sun. High up in the atmosphere, we have cold air, and then down closer to the Earth, we're going to have some warmer air. Now, under these circumstances, as pollutants are produced in the lower parts of the atmosphere, the warm air closer to the surface is able to mix with the cold air higher up, and as a result, any smog that's produced is allowed to move up away from where the people are into the upper atmosphere and blow away. However, a thermal inversion occurs if a cold air mass is going to form below a warm air mass. And the warm air mass right here is going to act to trap the air down low so that if smog forms, that smog isn't able to move up into the warm air mass, and the smog is going to accumulate here closer to the Earth. And when that smog is full of dangerous stuff, it's trapping that dangerous stuff close to the Earth and causing problems for people. This is kind of an unusual photograph that I found. In this case, you see a thermal inversion has occurred, and the warm air layer is high enough up, but it's also going down below the tops of some of these buildings here. So the cold air lower, in fact, you can even see a little spire sticking up over here, is trapping all the smog close to the surface. But on the higher, warmer air level, you can see the air is clear because the smog isn't able to move up from it. Carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide, or CO, is a gas that is produced by the incomplete burning of fossil fuels. And some other things too, but fossil fuel burning is one of the primary ways that we produce carbon monoxide. And by fossil fuels, we could be talking about coal, we could be talking about gasoline, we could be talking about natural gas. Why is carbon monoxide dangerous? Well, hopefully by now you know that we have to have oxygen all the time. And part of the responsibility of our respiratory system is to be taking oxygen in from our air, and our circulatory system is going to be then distributing oxygen to all the cells of the body that need it. And the cells in our blood that are responsible for carrying oxygen are red blood cells, or the big fancy term for that is erythrocytes. And here you see in a blood sample, most of these kind of pinkish cells that you see here are red blood cells. There are a few white blood cells or leukocytes here, and even a few platelets. Okay, but the ones we're looking at are the red blood cells here. Their job, and look how many more of them there are than any of these other cells that we see here. The job of red blood cells is to carry oxygen to all the other cells in our body that need it. Now, the problem with carbon monoxide is carbon monoxide, when we breathe it in, binds to the erythrocytes, to our red blood cells. But normally where oxygen would be given off to the different cells, carbon monoxide binds so tightly it doesn't release. So even though a person may be inhaling and exhaling normally, and there might be enough oxygen in the air around them, if you breathe in a sufficient amount of carbon monoxide, you're not going to have red blood cells that are able to carry oxygen. So the carbon monoxide binds to your red blood cells, prevents them from carrying oxygen, and this can lead, in severe cases, to suffocation and death. Now, how do we measure the amount of carbon monoxide or other gases in general? We measure them in what are called ppm, or parts per million. And the name is pretty self-explanatory. If we were to have 1 million molecules of gas in a jar, if we had 20 parts per million of carbon monoxide, of all those million particles, 20 of them would be carbon monoxide. So that's parts per million. Current U.S. air quality standards say that we shouldn't be exposed to carbon monoxide at levels of higher than 9 parts per million over an 8-hour period. Okay, and think about it, 9 parts per million is still a pretty small amount, but that's enough to start causing damage or problems with our red blood cells carrying oxygen. So over an 8-hour period, we shouldn't be exposed to 9 ppms of carbon monoxide. Over a 1-hour period, we shouldn't be exposed to carbon monoxide at levels higher than 35 parts per million. All right, with all of this background, now we've got enough information to do the lab. So you'll notice in our lab book, there's some background information that should sound pretty similar to the stuff that I was talking about here. As you read the lab, you'll also find there are some scenarios, and the scenarios are going to ask you to have, in a hypothetical situation, changing some conditions and see what the effects are on carbon monoxide levels. So this lab, when it's a face-to-face lab, would be computer simulation where you would be manipulating these conditions, and as a result see what the effects are on carbon monoxide levels. Operating remotely, you don't have the program in front of you, so you're not going to be able to manipulating these factors. But the lab will explain what factors would be manipulated, and your teacher, if your teacher isn't me, should have given you a PDF sheet that gives the results of changing each of the different conditions. So what are the conditions that could be changed? Could be changing in the percent amount, the percent change of carbon monoxide, either a percent increase in carbon monoxide or a percent decrease in carbon monoxide. You can change the number of cars or buses on the road, because the more cars and buses you have, the more burning of fossil fuels and the more carbon monoxide there would be. You can change the average speed of the traffic, and cars, buses moving, faster, they're going to mix up the carbon monoxide faster. Going slower, they're not going to mix it up quite so fast. You can change the wind speed, which is going to affect carbon monoxide by blowing that away. And another factor here is the ability to use reformulated gas, which is adding some chemicals to the gasoline to make it burn more cleanly, and as a result have less carbon monoxide in it. Now, each of the different parts of the lab are going to manipulate different conditions, so I can't stress this enough. Please read the lab before you start looking at the results. So the computer then simulates the effect of these different conditions on air pollution, specifically being carbon monoxide. And it's going to allow you to see the effects on carbon monoxide levels in our environment. In the document that your teacher gives you, or if you're in my class, it will be posted in Canvas, you will use the results from that PDF document to answer the questions that go along in the lab. So when you open up that PDF document, it should look something like this. This would be the results when we do the computer simulation. Now, don't panic. I know there's a lot of stuff in here, so I'm going to break down what you're going to be seeing here first. So if you look in the lower right-hand corner where it says specifications, so here's where you would be changing the different factors if we were actually doing this in a computer lab. So you could change the amount of carbon monoxide up or down as a percent. We can change the number of cars. We could change the number of buses per hour. We could change the number of cars that would be on the road during rush hour, and we can change other factors. So we could change the number of cars and other business hours. We could change average traffic speed. Now this is in kilometers per hour, not miles per hour. And then, as I said, we could change wind speed, or we could change, are you using reformulated gas, yes or no. And when we input these different conditions, we would then measure what's going on with carbon monoxide levels. And there's a couple of ways that we would look at that. One way would be to look at the graph, and you can see the arrows. I'm pointing to different parts of the graph here. Along our x-axis here, we're seeing time, so midnight, 4 a.m., 8 a.m., noon, etc. On our y-axis here, we're looking at carbon monoxide level in parts per million. So if we see green in our graph here for our 8-hour averages, that means that carbon monoxide levels are below the 9 parts per million, which, as we said before, over the 8-hour average is what we need, or is considered to be safe. Anytime we see red in our graph, like we see here, this means that our 8-hour average, the carbon monoxide levels are above the standards. Okay, and then looking in the lower left-hand corner, we see, so at the time of 4 a.m., carbon monoxide levels were 5.7 parts per million with 4,000 cars per hour and a wind speed of 13 kilometers per hour. Now notice this doesn't change. So for this particular section, you weren't changing wind speed here. What we were changing, however, was different times of day under these conditions. So we can see between 12 p.m. and 4 p.m. where there's significantly more cars. Wow, look what's happening to our carbon monoxide levels. Carbon monoxide levels are going up pretty significantly. So this is how you would be reading the results. As you're going through the document, you're going to use the information from the results here to answer the questions for each of the lab activities in the book. And that's it, folks. Get working on the lab and use the information in that PDF to answer the questions. Thanks for your time. Keep up the hard work, and we'll see you around.